What's going on today, guys? I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to walk through the book of Genesis. Now, is this going to be an exhaustive understanding of everything that Genesis has to offer? No. But we're going to hopefully walk through it and just kind of give a brief summary overview while we have some gameplay going on in the background. All right. So the book of Genesis has two kind of parts, I guess. Yeah, two parts. You would say the first part would be chapters 1 through 11, and then the second part would be chapters 12 through 50. Chapters 1 through 11 talk about God's relationship more with the entire world. And then chapters 12 through 50 talk more about God's relationship with one man and specifically his family. So we all know how the story goes. God creates the world, let there be light, and God creates man on the sixth day. He makes them in the Hebrew, it's named Adam. That's what human is. But then we kind of get a picture of them more on a personal level in Adam and Eve, right? Genesis 1, I believe is 26 and 27 says that God made man in his image. Now, does that mean that we look like God on a physical stature? No, that's not what it looks like, but rather man's responsibilities and roles on earth are in the image of the creator of the entire universe. And what that means is we were given this opportunity to be a reflection of God's character in the world, in that we have rule and dominion over the things in the world. We are called to care for the things of this world. So God puts Adam and Eve in this garden, and life is perfect. They're serving and stewarding what God had given them perfectly until they come across this serpent that basically manipulates and deceives them into eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And one of the ways he manipulates Adam and Eve is saying that they can become more like God in their knowledge of good and evil. And really what this is the root of is, who do they trust as their authority? Who do they trust as their ultimate ruler, themselves or God? And we all know how Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And through that, sin enters the world, separating man from God. And what's really interesting is it wasn't God who separated us first, but man who ran from God and hid from God. So there are now consequences of sin. For man, it is suffering and toil through their lives, and that now their lives will end. Death has now entered the world through sin, but also the consequences of sin is towards the snake, the deceiver. And the good news is that God in this moment makes a promise that through a descendant of man, there will be a strike on the serpent that will kill and end the work of the serpent, but it comes at a cost. And the way it's described is there's a bruising of the heel of the descendant of Adam. And this gives us a picture of this promised wounded victor. And the cool thing is we get to know the entire story. This wounded victor is Jesus, who strikes the serpent, and his wound is his wounds on the cross, right? This right here is an act of God's grace, promising to eventually rescue them from the sin that they kind of walk themselves into, and specifically who I'm talking about is man, right? Over chapters like 4 through 6, I believe, there's this spiraling down effect of sin and sin increasing in the world. In just the next generation, Cain kills his brother Abel. In the next chapter, we see this guy named Lamech who's so much worse than Cain, and he brags about it. And it's mind-blowing. This man is bragging about being a worse person than the first murderer. And then in chapter 6, we encounter these sons of God who produce these Nephilim, who are like these giant, strong, human-like creatures. These Nephilim are basically the leaders and the poster childs of those who are charging forward to fill God's world with even more violence and corruption. Humanity and all that it has corrupted the goodness of God's creation, and God decides to create a flood. And we see that the entire world, more or less, is destroyed in this flood. And in the midst of all the chaos, God chooses one family, one man, and his name is Noah. Well, Noah, even though he's righteous in God's eyes, he still makes mistakes, and out of this drunken mistake, sin continues to spiral in this world. Eventually in Babylon, humans start building a tower and plan to reach like the stars with this tower and the heavens and equate themselves with God and make a great name for themselves. It's an image that humans distrust the creator of all things and want a big ego. Well, God ends up humbling them by destroying their tower and spreading them out across the world through locations and also through tongue, making them not able to communicate with themselves. It's a humbling moment for them. So far, we've seen chance after chance of humans trying to get this thing right, and they just keep on messing it up. But let's go back to the consequences of sin and the promise of a wounded victor. And that's where the story hinges, and we transition to the rest of the Bible looking for this wounded victor. So in Genesis chapter 12, God calls this man named Abram to move to the land of Canaan, and he promises that out of him, he will make a great nation. Well, why Abram? What's so special about this guy? Honestly, nothing outside the fact that God chooses him and that all the families of the world would be blessed through him. Specifically, God will rescue the people in this world through this wounded victor. Now, this man, Abram, he eventually is renamed Abraham. This guy is not perfect. He makes mistakes. Not only once, but twice does he tell people that his wife isn't actually his wife because he's afraid that he might die. And then his second grave mistake is God promises that he will have a son, and through his family, all the nations of the world may be blessed. But yet, he and his wife don't trust the Lord in that. And his wife basically gives Abraham a servant of his, and through this servant, he has his first son, Ishmael. But this son isn't of the promise of God. This is of Abraham and Sarah's own ego and trying again for humans to do it on their own. But despite Abraham's rebellious act, God creates an official covenant with him in Genesis chapter 15. And the symbolism of this covenant is circumcision, and that circumcision is a physical identification that you are a part of God's family. Abraham has this son named Isaac. Isaac then has two sons named Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name means deceiver, which is going to be really ironic in a second. So Jacob deceives his father and gains the inheritance that his brother Esau, the firstborn, deserved. Now, the funny part of this is that Jacob is then deceived by basically his father-in-law, who wastes away years of his life because he's just trying to get rid of his daughters, more or less, and get them married. And while he only loves one of his wives, he ends up accumulating 4 in the time that he is being deceived. Jacob then returns to his homeland and wrestles with God in this weird encounter that Jacob's like demanding God's blessing, and God kind of gives it to him and renames him Israel. But after this moment, you really can tell that Jacob's never the same. Now, Jacob has 12 sons, and his favorite is Joseph, the second to youngest. And he loves Joseph so much more, and it's symbolized in this coat or jacket that's special, and it's given to Joseph. Jacob's other sons get super jealous and basically plot to kill the favorite child. But what they end up doing is they sell Joseph into slavery, and Joseph ends up being in Egypt. And while in Egypt, he's working for this guy named Potiphar. And while working for this guy named Potiphar, his wife basically accuses him of trying to lie with her, even though he never did that at all. So he's thrown into jail for something that he never did. He's an innocent man. And while in jail, he comes across these 2 other guys that eventually one of them remembers him in a way that he interpreted his dream, and Joseph is given this opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dream, where basically there's going to be 7 years of famine, or 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So through the interpretation of this dream, Joseph now is elevated to the right hand of Pharaoh, the most powerful man outside of Pharaoh, just because Pharaoh's sitting on the throne. This means that Joseph now has basically dominion and control over all things that is Pharaoh's. The thing about this famine and this dream that Joseph interpreted, it's not restricted just to Egypt, but it's more or less the entire region of where they are. And what ends up happening is Joseph's brothers come to Egypt seeking food. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph shows them an incredible act of grace where he did not have to, and saves his brothers, eventually leading to Jacob bringing over his entire family to Egypt. So now Israel is in Egypt and they have great favor with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The beautiful part of the book of Genesis is that through the midst of sin, men committing sinful, heinous, terrible acts, God continues to give them grace upon grace upon grace for one reason and one reason only, because he's fulfilling the promise that he gave back in the early part of Genesis, where he says this wounded victor will strike down this serpent. God's using sin upon sin upon sin for good. It's summarized basically in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, where Joseph says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." This is just a glimpse of the picture of what happens for us in Christ Jesus, in that if we trust in Jesus Christ, God uses the most horrible, heinous act, worst sin of all time, of this innocent man being crucified on a cross for a crime he never committed, and through the most heinous act of all time, the greatest gift is ever given, eternal life. Death has now been defeated through Christ. And Jesus Christ comes through the line of Jacob, and it is through the line of Judah, Jacob's fourth oldest son, in which this wounded victor comes from. That is why Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of walkthrough of Genesis. Let me know if you guys want me to do another book or walk through Exodus and stuff like that. Again, this isn't an exhaustive summary, so if you guys have things that you want to put in, feel free to throw that in the comments. But until next time, keep on pursuing Jesus. Keep on being in the Word. Keep on showing up at church. Be in prayer. And I'm going to add on to the church thing of try to find ways to serve in the church. It will get you more plugged in, and serving in the church is incredibly important. Keep on pursuing Jesus, guys. He's worth it.